now. All right, we're on.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michelle Nellenbach. I'm with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we are thrilled to be joined by 4 experts in the technology Congress space to talk about OTA and other needs of in technology needs on the Hill. So we're starting with, we're joined by Zach Graves, who is the head of the policy at the Lincoln Network, where his work focuses on the intersection of technology and governance issues. Prior to Lincoln, he was the founder and former director of R Street Institute's Technology and Innovation Policy Program. Also today is Dr. Ali Nouri, who is the president of the Federation of American Scientists. Until recently, he served as a legislative director and national security advisor to U.S. Senator Al Franken, where he oversaw the work of the senator's legislative team. And then prior to that, he worked for Senator Jim Webb from Virginia. Also today, we have Daniel Schuman, who is a policy director at Demand Progress and the Demand Progress Education Fund, which are projects of the New Venture Fund and the 16 Third Fund, respectively. He leads their efforts on issues that concern governmental transparency, accountability, and reform. And he co-founded the Congressional Data Coalition. And then finally, my colleague at the BBC, Franz Werfsmann-Dobler, I think I got that right. He is the senior advisor at BBC. He has more than 2 decades of congressional experience. During his tenure on Capitol Hill, he worked in the offices of U.S. Senators Robert Byrd, Byron Dorgan, and Chris Coons, the last of which he served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor. So welcome to all of our speakers. Thank you so much for coming today, for being here today. And we're new to the Zoom webcast, but it's we're trying it out as a new way to reach congressional staff and kind of help y'all do your job. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to each of you. I think Ali was going to go first to talk a little bit about these issues and why you wanted to be part of the program today.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So today I'm your moderator. So for folks watching or listening in, please do send us your questions as we go along, and I'll be reading these. And if you're calling in, feel free to email your questions to anouri, A-N-O-U-R-I, @fas.org, so I can go through those. Honored to be joined by these experts today. Of course, this is an unprecedented time, and I hope everybody's keeping healthy. It's also times like this where we really come to appreciate the power of science and technology to solve global problems, especially this coronavirus issue that we find ourselves in the midst of. And so today we're going to hear from a few individuals who really have a lot of deep expertise. You heard their bios in science and technology advice to Congress, and the sort of capabilities and capacities that the legislative branch has to help staff as you're dealing with these challenges. We're going to mostly focus on the resources available to you in the legislative branch, but also what could be possible under different scenarios. So for example, we will hear about the Congressional Research Service, which you probably are using every day. Some of you may not be aware that the Government Accountability Office, GAO, has a STAA unit. It's a Science, Technology Assessment and Analytics unit, which is there to help guide you on your science and technology challenges. We'll also hear from experts on the Office of Technology Assessment. This was an office that ran for 20 years and then it got abolished in 1994. I was going through the OTA archives this morning, and I just typed in the word virus and I got about 10 reports on HIV/AIDS because the office was operating while that was a major crisis. And I was just thinking about all the incredible work that office or structures like it could be doing right now on the coronavirus. So that's essentially what we're going to talk about. Of course, you also all use external advisory panels and experts. You all have your trusted organizations that you go to, or experts back in the home district. So my organization, if I could just talk briefly about what we're doing right now on coronavirus, is the Federation of American Scientists, and we're really relying on a crowdsourcing model. So we have set up a team within FAS working virtually, and a team of external scientists. We have about 300 scientists, medical doctors, public health experts volunteering their time, and we're answering the public's and the policymakers' questions on coronavirus. So if you're one of those people and you have questions, you can either email sciencepolicy@fas.org or email me directly, which is, I think, on your screens, anouri@fas.org. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to Zach Graves with the Lincoln Network to talk about his work and what he sees on the horizon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ollie. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit more in the weeds versus the sort of higher level discussion of S&T resources. Something Daniel and I have been working on for the past several years is restoring a technology assessment capacity to Congress. And that's a TA is a kind of specific kind of long form multidisciplinary analytic product that the OTA once provided. That's the Office of Technology Assessment. I'll talk a little bit about that. And now that they're also starting to do at the GAO's STAA research unit. So first I'll talk a little about the OTA. It's an agency that was authorized in 1972. It came out of the Committee on Aeronautics and Space which is now the Science Committee in the House. There were hearings and discussions about meeting new scientific and technical challenges, the sort of space race, the Sputnik moment, supersonic flight, climate. They're all discussions that sort of fed into this creation of the OTA. The idea was to give greater ability to sort of forecast, horizon scan, and really understand some of the deep technical details of the issues that were coming before the legislature. So it was authorized in 1972. It wasn't funded until 1974 when it really got up and running. It persisted for a number of years. It was defunded in 1995, stuck around for a little bit in 1996. It was sort of a casualty of the politics of the Republican Revolution, and was sort of a convenient scalp to take to show a kind of symbolic willingness to make significant cuts within Congress. The idea was that this would give some moral grounding to go out and abolish cabinet agencies and make deeper cuts elsewhere, although those never really materialized. At the same time, they made steep cuts to GAO, to congressional committees, and so it was really somewhat indiscriminate at the time, and the institution really hasn't fully recovered from that. I think committees are still about 1,000 FTE off from where they were in the early 90s. OTA is authorized, but was never fully restored. And GAO is still several thousand people short as well. OTA was a pretty small agency, 140 full-time people, another 50 or 60 project-based contractors at any given time. Its peak budget was about 37 million in today's dollars, so it would still be by far the smallest of the advisory agencies in Congress. CRS, by contrast, is about 125 million, around 550 employees today, and GAO is around 600 million. So there's been a number of efforts to try and restore OTA and its sort of capacity for long-form, deep analytic projects on science and technology after it was defunded. One of them was to sort of rebuild this function within the GAO, which was seen as sort of easier than sort of getting this old agency restarted. So this led to the creation of a pilot in 2002 to do technology assessment work. This stuck around for a number of years. Its initial work was, reviewed pretty well, but it stayed as a, $1 million or so pilot program for many years until it was elevated to a full mission team and given greater resourcing This launched at the beginning of 2019. That's the aforementioned Science, Technology Assessment, and Analytics team that they created. That's up to, I believe, 80 or 90 FTE staff now. So it's grown pretty significantly. It does stuff in its mission that's a little bit different than the original OTA. It has some more traditional science tech related audit work as part of its mission. Its methodology is a little bit different. Some of its critics have argued that its culture is a lot harder and different than the original OTA to do the kind of work that OTA did. And so we're in a space now where they're trying to scale up. It factored pretty prominently in the GAO's new budget request. They were talking a lot about scaling this, and particularly in light of COVID-19, there's a lot of interest in having the kind of analytic products that will help Congress make decisions to strengthen our institutions to be more resilient against future outbreaks of this sort, to make the investments. We're making a lot of investments in R&D across a number of agencies to make sure that we reverse the diminishing returns that we've been getting on those, and make them more effective. And the idea is, whether that's GAO or whether that's a recreated OTA, that we need this greater kind of deep dive capacity within Congress. It's not something that just the legislative branch can do. We need the capability to provide deep technical oversight of what the executive branch is doing, to guide the authorizing statutes, to guide the institutions of federal agencies in the right way, and to really have some accountability to the money that's being spent. So this is where the conversation is. There's a number of different proposals as to sort of how to restructure STAA, how to create a modern version of OTA, and there's a number of criticisms that the original model had, or ways that it might need to be updated, given that Congress as an institution is fairly different today versus the way it was in the 60s or 70s. I'm happy to talk about those things later, but I don't want to monopolize the whole discussion, so I'm going to kick that over to the next panelist.
Thank you, Zach. I believe we will next hear from Daniel Schulman.
Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Schulman with Demand Progress. So I will be more brief than Zach, I suspect. But just to talk about the context of, so Zach did an amazing job of sort of laying out how we got here. So where is it that we actually are? There have been a couple of major reports that have come out in the last year or two that have focused on the questions of, do we have sufficient resources for the legislative branch to do the work that it needs to do, particularly when it comes to science and technology policy? And they've all had a couple of commonalities to the recommendations. But first, it's useful to name the reports. There was the Harvard Belfer report that sort of dug into a significant aspect in terms of the gaps and absorptive problems inside the legislative branch to receive the information that it needs. There was a report that was commissioned by the House and Senate jointly that was conducted by the National Academy of Public Administration. And there was a report that Zach and I put out as well through the Ash Center that also looked at a lot of questions. And what you keep seeing with all of the reports is they say a couple of things. First of all, they say that there's a problem, right? There is a known gap of information that Congress needs that's not being provided to it by the current institutions, that are not being provided to it by CRS, that are not being provided necessarily by GAO, that are not coming from the national academies, not because their work isn't good, but because the way that they answer questions is a little bit different from the way Congress uses them. And so that there is this gap both for information being provided to Congress in the way that they need, both timely, authoritative, comprehensive, and so on and so forth, but also in terms of questions around like future scanning, horizon scanning, trying to figure out what's coming next and addressing it, which was something that the original Office of Technology Assessment did to a fair extent. They've also looked at questions around who could do this work. So CRS, by its nature, doesn't do this type of work. I used to work at CRS. It tends to be short form, quick response, more like literature reviews or very, very quick analysis. It's not generating new content. GAO is on the other side of this, where generally speaking, its work is much more long form. It takes a long time to be generated. The national academies will often get asked questions, but like they reflect consensus views as opposed to weighing more of the different perspectives and helping to analyze them. So, and in the STAA inside GAO is still nascent. It's just sort of standing up. It's not where it needs to be yet. While they have put out some great recent products, including on the coronavirus, you know, there still seems to be pieces that there's missing. So all of these reports have suggested basically that there is, in addition to the sort of retrospective or agency analyzing, like how well did this agency deal with this problem or set of problems, there's also a need for like horizon scanning or futurism, like 10, 20 years from now, like what do things mean? What should Congress be paying attention to and giving it to them in the way that they need? NAPA, the National Academy of Public Administration, suggested the creation of OCSTA, which is Office of Science and Office, gosh, I forget now. It's OSCIT, something information technology. So they had the recommendation. Zach and I recommended the Technology Assessment Service. Belfer had, I think, their own suggestion. I forget what the name was, but there's all sort of efforts to identify this additional need that exists that's not being addressed currently. And there is a consensus, while not necessarily on what should be stood up, that there should be something else that should be stood up in some fashion, arising from just sort of the GAO's nature not necessarily being the perfect fit to do some of these other things as well. There's a lot more I could say, but I will stop there because it's probably too much already, and I'll turn it back so that we can get to the next panelist.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Franz.
Thanks very much. And I'll just note quickly to Daniel that there seems to be a couple of people who are trying to get on who've had some difficulty. Don't know if that's something we can resolve, but just want to make you aware of that. Thanks everyone for the opportunity. As many of you are on today through your work in either a committee or a personal office, this is something that may have connected to the type of things that you're working on and relevant to issues that you're dealing with. And the topic itself has become much more higher profile in the last couple of years. And I'll just add to what a couple of my colleagues have said here in that just recently, the cybersecurity study came out, one of its recommendations indicated the creation of an OTA or similar type of organization to address that issue. Additionally, a year ago, the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress mentioned this as one of the ideas to help address some of the internal improvements for the House, which was on that side of it, but certainly it benefits both the House and the Senate. And I think the larger issue is that this is increased in profile as an important issue for Congress and the types of issues that Congress is addressing. It's an opportunity for you all to think about as you're going about your work and what resources need to be available in your personal office, in the committees, and elsewhere. Another aspect that was mentioned, as Daniel mentioned, the NAPA report, it was very clear that these resources, this capacity, was lacking at many different levels. And one of the ways that might be helpful for the larger part of this conversation is just to mention that the larger context was there were many more staff and resources in the late 1980s. The number of staff at that point probably peaked around 30,000. The number of staff today working is probably down by 1/3, closer to 20,000. And those are challenges across the board for many of the agencies that help support the work of Congress. The OTA, as Zach and others have mentioned, was defunded in 1995. And there are still other functions that the GAO and others have picked up, which have been very important. But one of the questions that leads to this is the parity issue, knowing that on the executive branch side, you have the Office of Science Technology Policy, which is a critical role of coordination among the executive branch agencies and providing advice to the president. That is not saying it doesn't exist on the congressional side at all, but certainly want to look at ways to enhance that, which is part of the conversation today. what many don't also recognize or realize in terms of the total amount of funding that's available is that if you're looking at discretionary appropriations, about a $1.3 trillion appropriations annual budget, 99% of that goes to the executive branch. 0.5% goes to the legislative branch, and the other 0.5% goes to the judiciary. So Congress is really functioning with a different level of resources, and even small amounts that could be directed to these types of enhancements would be pretty critical. I was a congressional staffer for a number of years. In many cases, I did find it would be very helpful to understand a certain topic, and sometimes it was hard to know exactly where to turn. CRS is incredibly helpful. The National Academy of Sciences provides ways to, as an outlet to do in-depth scientific and technical reports, but sometimes there just wasn't aware of the types of resources that were available. So we definitely look forward to opportunities and to let you know that we all are resources to you during this time, but also as the conversations continue in the Senate, in the House, about how to ensure that you all have the technical tools available for you to do your jobs.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that excellent overview. So we heard from the history of the Office of Technology Assessment. We heard about GAO and the STAA unit within it, as well as new proposals for the OXTA office and others. And then we also heard a very nice summary of the various needs that Congress has from Franz, who worked there for 25 years, and some of the legislation on the horizon. So just to start off, thinking about the coronavirus and the challenges we face, if we think about the short-term questions that Congress has, the medium-term questions, and the long-term questions on this crisis, when I think about a short-term question or challenge, it's things like, what can my office do to make sure the executive branch is doing everything it can, has all the funding it needs to develop diagnostic tests and get it out. And then we have medium-term questions as well as longer-term questions, like, for example, when we're all done with this crisis, perhaps a year from now, that's the length of time it's going to take to develop a vaccine, minimum. What are going to be some of the impacts of this crisis on the healthcare system writ large? And how do we start thinking about those issues? So if we could just hear from the panelists that want to take that in terms of what structures do we have right now that can answer those questions, and where are the gaps? Where do we need new work? And please just jump in. I actually don't have a hand raising function on my screen.
Ollie, I'll take a first shot at that. As you know, during this very uncertain time, there's all kinds of ideas that are being thrown against the wall on ways to respond. And there's possibly many good ideas out there. Offices are often the recipients of those ideas, and staff in-house or on committees sometimes don't really know how to vet some of those ideas. And while they're certainly very capable folks, it's often beneficial to be able to get a sounding board on, if this is practical, can we do this? What are some of the questions behind it? And so if there was that additional capability within Congress to look at some of these questions about pandemics, emerging infectious diseases, how to prepare for that in the future, that could be very beneficial as people are trying to grapple with the immediate future. It is not that CRS isn't a repository, because they have been putting out some papers, but someone who could respond to members' offices or committees would be potentially beneficial in a situation like this.
And is STAA serving some of that role? Could it be serving some of that role, Daniel or Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I could serve some of the role. So I'm thinking about this more in the context of the coronavirus or something like it is easily anticipatable, right? We had a number of continuity of government discussions in the early 2000s, and they discussed things like how do you deal with anthrax and how do you deal with that type of stuff. And there was also the likelihood that there would be a pandemic at some point. And thinking through from a congressional perspective, well, what does that mean? What resources need to come to bear? Some of it is like, what do the rules look like? It might be a question for CRS, or maybe it's a question for GAO. But if it's a question of, well, what measures we need to put in place? How do you make offices work? What technology needs to be available? What does it look like to have a remote parliament? Like those questions may fit within the box of bringing together science and technology, sort of the merging of what's the etiology of this? How would it spread? Who's the first people to identify it? How do you make sure that the different components coordinate with each other? So each of these things seems like they're suited to different parts of the legislative branch firmament. Questions about the rules are council and CRS. Questions about how do you oversee the agencies as GAO. But like the integration of all this and putting it together with like best and not so best recommendations, that actually is a role that an entity like an OTA or an STA that has this sort of future scanning function could fulfill. So this is actually, that would be a logical place to be addressing the other things that will be coming. Now, I don't think I'm fully responsive to your question. Your question is like, what is available currently right now? And the answer is like STAA is rushing a lot of things out the door right now. CRS has pushed out a lot of reports as well. CRS should put up its old reports. We actually have a number of their old reports up on our website, everycrsreport.com. And they're also up on the Federation of American Scientists website that talk about like all the stuff that happened in the early 2000s and the effort to deal with continuity of government then. So CRS could publish those other reports that it doesn't have available to members or publicly available. There's a number of old hearings that could be serviced. So like the library folks, whether at the Library of Congress or inside the House and Senate Library, could elevate those old hearing records and bring out the efforts that were made to sort of deal with this previously. Some of this is new, but a lot of this was thought about before, and there were some recommendations that either didn't happen because the technology wasn't there, like the video commuting software was not mature in 2003, 2004, 2005 in the way that it is now. So having someone who's thinking about how these things change and planning for it and writing about it and getting Congress in a posture to deal with it is something that is desperately needed, and it's why we're having in part why we're having such a hard time grappling with it now.
Zach, if we had a Office of Technology Assessment right now, what would that office be doing in terms of supporting congressional capacity to address coronavirus?
Yeah, I mean, so the place where an OTA or STAA or similar vehicle, if it's really fully operational, would have helped us with coronavirus is, getting us prepared, 2 to 5 years ago, before we're in the mess we're in now. Suddenly creating one again and strengthening such an office is a great move, but the kinds of stuff it produces works on a longer time scale for the most part than something that'll help us be reactive. So it'll help us, if we were to do it now, it'll help us make good investments for science and technology. It'll help us improve our stockpiles and strategic reserves for medical equipment, make the right regulatory reforms that'll put us in a better place in the future to make the right kind of investments in synthetic biology and basic science that'll support quicker vaccines in the future. It might recommend, there's this idea of creating a DARPA for health, which may be really helpful in this. And OTA is the kind of thing that can help advise on the creation of these institutions, really helping Congress understand the trade-offs of different policy approaches to respond to a crisis like this, and hopefully put us in a position where we're better prepared the next time one comes around, and it almost certainly will.
Can I have one thing to that super fast?
Yes.
I would just add, so the administration has just put out it's been reported that the administration will not send its senior folks to testify before the legislative branch on anything related to coronavirus because they're busy dealing with the response. And if these are the senior scientists or senior experts and they can come to the ledge branch or they won't come to the ledge branch, they need to have people here who can answer the questions that members of Congress have about what should be done as well. And they shouldn't be relying on the executive branch. They should have their own people to check these assumptions to begin with. So sorry to interject, but I thought that was an important point.
Great point. Thank you. So if part of the answer is OTA or an OTA-like structure with these science and technology advisors being somewhat embedded within the legislative branch, within Congress, what has changed? I mean, we had the OTA, right? It was eliminated in '94. It was seen by some as partisan. So what has changed in the way OTA is regarded today, and what are the prospects for bringing back the OTA or some version of it?
Sure. So I'm happy to talk about the sort of partisan charge as the person coming from the right side of the aisle here. Like I said, the main reason why OTA was defunded was for sort of near-term political expedience to have a scalp to take as part of the broader policy priorities of the Republican Revolution and the contract with America. I think it was short-sighted and not a smart policy approach. But I don't think it really had to do with deep policy beliefs about the nature of the agency. It was more that they wanted an agency to eliminate, and that was the easiest one to eliminate since it was the smallest legislative branch agency and had a relatively small constituency of committees that really cared about it, and the committees were getting slashed anyway. So relatively easy for them to do. There were some other things which I think played less of a significant factor, but that are notable. The big one is probably a controversy that OTA got into around commenting on the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Reagan Star Wars program. I did a number of different reports that were pretty critical of this initiative, and that were seen as, by some members of Congress at the time as having a kind of a partisan bias. I'm not sure that that's right. I think that, that view that putting, lasers in space to shoot down missiles in the 1980s with that technology probably wasn't super reliable or cost effective. And so I think their work on that is probably vindicated there. And so, I don't think there are a lot of people around in Congress that remember that or care about it as a big issue. So I think there is some baggage that persists about how people feel about OTA, but it's kind of an Irish grudge. The Republicans are mad, but they don't really remember why. And a lot of that can be addressed by modernizing it, changing the name of the agency, doing something that's a little bit different. And there's a number of other ways I think you'd want to change the model. As I mentioned, one of the big ones is making it more responsive to rank and file member requests, not just, only responsive to committee chairmen and ranking members. I think you'd also want to better integrate the kind of products it does, in the sort of ecosystem of different report types that are available. I mean, one of the big problems with, I think, GAO's STAA program is not very many people know that it exists, know how it's different from other kinds of GAO reports. They have strong feelings about the sluggishness and process for getting regular GAO audits, and that's a barrier to building demand for this work. The other thing that I think is important that STAA is developing is intermediary length products between the CRS report, which is typically a relatively short review of existing literature that's produced relatively quickly. The OTA reports are typically very robust, took around 18 months, sort of like GAO reports. There were multi-layers of peer review of different experts from different disciplines, consultations with advisory panels from industry and academia, which created a very authoritative, robust product that had a lot of useful information in it. But not everything can wait 18 months. We certainly don't want to do a technology assessment of responses to COVID and have it come out 2 years from now. That wouldn't be very useful. So something GAO is developing, which I think is the right approach, is something in between, a series of products that are in between the sort of CRS memo length and the TA length, which I think is a smart approach, and also a gap that the NAPA report identified. And I think they're right on there.
Hans, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just like to make 2 points here. The first one is to look a little bit at the historic context for some of the changes that happened after the OTA was defunded. It certainly didn't mean that all of the resources went away or the outlets for looking at science and technology issues. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine picked up that mantle somewhat in that they started to do a lot more work on behalf of the Congress. That is certainly possible, just so that folks are aware. It is a little bit more cumbersome in that you have to get the funding for it, you have to get it appropriated, an agency has to be the contractor with the national academies to do that work. It takes $1 million to $1.5 million and about 2 years to do, sometimes a little bit shorter. So that was an outlet. The GAO certainly has picked up its effort and has started a brand new mission, as Zach and others have mentioned, that are beneficial. But it is often the case that there's topics today that the Congress is dealing with on artificial intelligence, on cybersecurity, on big data, this question about pandemics right now, that not that pandemics weren't before, but topics that didn't exist at all as concerns to society and to public policy at the time that the OTA went away, and that the capacity is not there as much for staff and members to draw upon as they're starting to dig into some of the issues.
Great. I have a question for you, for any or all of you. Reading the Belfer Center report or the National Academy of Public Administration report, one of the things that they both noted was, in talking to staffers, the number one need is really short turnaround time point, right? For questions that staffers have, they need an answer in hours or days, right? My organization right now, is getting calls from folks on the Hill who are really interested, for example, in understanding why it is that South Korea is conducting so many more tests on coronavirus, and what are the concrete steps that need to be taken in the CDC, in the public health labs, in these CLIA certified labs to ramp up US testing. And they need that answer within 24 hours, right? Because 2 weeks from now, it's too late, right? 2 weeks from now, we will have moved on from the testing issue, and we'll be dealing with, do we have enough hospital beds, and do we have enough ventilators? So who can I turn to in the legislative branch to get answers to those immediate questions? Is there anybody? And if not, what do we need to do to bring that capacity online? Anybody want to take that?
I'll take it to start, and then
Great.
others can correct me for the things that I misstate. So in part, no, right? So in part, yes, in part, no. So like immediate turnaround responsive, like summaries of existing literature, CRS. Science and technology, like we do have some stuff that's coming from the STAA inside GAO. But and there's also Infectious International, like the Law Library of Congress. But generally speaking, like all these systems are not designed from a Congress-centric perspective. If I am a staffer, and I used to be one, if I'm a staffer and I'm looking for all the resources available on the coronavirus that's available, I want everything that's from CRS in one place, along with everything that's from GAO and that's from STAA, that's from the national academies, that's available from researchers around the world. Like I want someone gathering and curating it and making it available so that I can find the stuff that exists already. And if there's something that I need to have turn around quickly, I want to be able to find the right expert, or find the person who knows the right expert and talk to that person. And if it's something like this where everybody wants to talk to them, right? Because this is a circumstance where every office wants to talk to the expert as to what they should be doing. They needed to have someone facilitating that connection between the scientific world and validating that this is a real person, not, you know, some like sort of random person, and helping to facilitate the conversation, that facilitate that flow of information. We can see all the information that's flowing out there now. You know, is touching cardboard dangerous? How long is it dangerous for? How many people can I have safely in the room? Am I really going to have to stay at home for 2 weeks, or is it 3 months, or is it 18 months? Are we going to go through rounds of like being sequestered and then be free, and then sequestered and be like, all of these questions, and just putting in the coronavirus context just because it's most facile, are things where it's not clear where you get that information from, and it's not the attending physician in the Capitol complex, right? Not there's anything wrong with Dr. Monahan, but that's not the best avenue for answering the policy questions. So there isn't a thing that does it in the way that it needs to exist, which is someone who's got the 360-degree view of all the legislative branch agencies, the things that exist in the executive branch, the things that are available internationally, because there's a lot of research on this overseas that people wouldn't necessarily, including parliaments around the world, that are putting, that they have their own OTAs that are putting out their own assessments of this, their own analysis, and none of that's being serviced because nobody even thinks to look there. So there isn't that nucleus, that central place, that touchstone where you start there first and they help you figure out the rest. And that is something that is desperately needed, and that OTA or an OTA-like entity can help fulfill.
Great.
Yeah, I think some of this, you know, is, you know, some of the really short rapid response stuff still belongs in CRS. And while it has some institutional, cultural management challenges, you know, I think you still don't want to try and necessarily rebuild that elsewhere. You know, the place where FCAA or an OTA is strongest is in, you know, the longer term reports that set you up to be prepared, that set you up to have foresight, to be ready when these kind of crises happen. But responding minute by minute, you know, in the midst of them is a place where you know, you're better suited, I think, getting the kind of expertise that the product that CRS produces. You know, there's a lot of room to grow. I think, you know, the seniority and level of experts that they have, perhaps the number, perhaps some of the issues with structure. Daniel can talk about that in a little more depth, I think. But I think we need to be careful that when we're talking about like OTA or rebuilding OTA in one way or another, there's not a catch-all for every scientific and technological issue that might be before Congress, including fixing the fax machines. You know, the TA model serves a sort of specific purpose in this broader ecosystem. It's a very useful kind of expertise and product, and one where I think you probably get a higher ROI per dollar than in many other places. But it's still not a substitute for putting more experts on committees or in CRS or in other places as well.
Great, thank you, Zach. So we have a question from one of our attendees. Several panelists have mentioned structuring OTA differently. Could you expand on some of the broader themes we should think about when it comes to restructuring the OTA? I think Daniel is going to start on that.
Sure. So actually, Zach, do you want to go first? Because I'll defer to you because I know you want to talk about the advisory board, and then I can talk about the rest.
Yeah. So I mean, without getting into too many, you know, boring weeds here, you know, I'll just mention briefly that OTA had a pretty unique governing model for congressional agencies. It had what's called a technology assessment board, which was 12 members of Congress and then the director, who's a non-voting member. The members of Congress were evenly split by party. There were 6 from the House, 6 from the Senate, you know, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats from each. And so it worked sort of like a joint committee. And these people hired the director, approved requests for reports on the front end and their release on the back end. So had a lot of real kind of bipartisan ownership. It developed a really interesting cooperative bipartisan culture in the way it worked. And this also, you know, on the downside of this, you can wonder, you know, will this, you know, in theory, this could lead to today, if you were to recreate it, you know, holding back sensitive analysis on, you know, issues like climate change or other things that tend to be polarized. But and during its time, I think there's a lot of good examples of it producing things that even the members of its board went back and criticized from their personal offices afterwards. So, so that's an important governing structure. Another structure they had was that Daniel just mentioned is the TAC, as an advisory council. The role of the advisory council evolved a little bit in different years of OTA's existence. But overall, as I mentioned earlier, they tended to be most responsive to report requests from congressional committees, chairman and ranking members. Some reports could be unilaterally approved by the tab, and some were at the request of the director, but mostly it worked like GAO and its congressional protocols. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's some challenges with this. Committees are less central to making all of the decisions than they used to be in the 60s and 70s. And some of this decision making, is arguably spread out a little bit. There's interest from a broader swath of members of Congress in getting highly complex technical analysis, particularly as more, these kind of science and technology issues are prominent in our national discourse. So one of the issues on modernizing the OTA model that people have talked about a lot is making it more accessible. There are different ways to try to do this. Obviously, doing 18-month-long multidisciplinary studies can be fairly expensive. And so you're probably not going to fund it at a level where every single member of Congress can get one whenever they want, in the way that they can get a memo from CRS. But there are ways to sort of prevent blockages in particular committees or from leadership to, say if 20 members want to report on something, to prioritize that the same way as if a committee chairman asked it. Maybe you want to prioritize requests that are bipartisan or that are bicameral. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, and I think that could be structured better than the original OTA model. The other thing that I mentioned is, changing the kind of different kinds of reports that it is doing. You don't necessarily want it to take CRS's role over, but there is that gap in between the 1 or 2 year long report and the couple week report. So something in that 6 month space, you're not trading off too much authoritativeness. You're still able to get a multidisciplinary perspective to provide one of the core things in many OTA reports is called policy options, where they're not making a recommendation like an advocacy group, say vote for this bill, but they're going to say, if you take this approach, here are some of the trade-offs that might happen from an economic lens, from a technical lens, from a security lens, and then doing that for a bunch of the major different policy proposals that have been out there on an issue. So I think that's really valuable. I think creating space for them to evolve out of just doing only the really long stuff and also doing some sort of medium term stuff is a good way to modernize the model. Otherwise, I think that governing board that I talked about might not be as functional today as it used to be. I mean, the early years of OTA were a little rocky. There were allegations of capture, particularly as Ted Kennedy's involvement, putting personally loyal staff on, trying to play games politically with some of the stuff that the OTA did. So while it evolved this really good bipartisan culture and norms, that is all gone now. No one remembers that. If you were to reconstitute it, you'd have to rebuild that. And would it work as well today? I think there's an argument that Congress as an institution is more polarized, particularly on some science and technology topics. And so having a really strong congressional oversight board might be a failure point. And so instead, making it more independent, embedding it like this is perhaps a plus of the STAA model, which is more run by the Controller General and sort of is a stepped remove where he has, I think a 15-year term. And so you build that step of removal away, you may give it a little bit more independence. There are a number of other different ways that you might try to modernize it. One of the off-the-wall proposals Daniel and I suggested is putting Wikipedians in residence at such an office, because the first place many congressional staff go is Google. The first result there is often Wikipedia. And so if you fill those pages with really robust links to high quality research, that might be a good place to help. But Daniel, I want to kick that back to you because I know you have other things you think are good too.
Yeah, so, and I'll do these really fast. So Zach was right about who asked the questions. So like putting aside a certain percentage of resources to answer questions that are not coming from committee chairs, but are coming from aggregates of folks, or maybe folks on a bipartisan basis would be very useful. You definitely want to have a separate line item in the budget. Same thing is true for the STAA. How you choose the head is very important. So it wouldn't be the board that currently exists, but maybe it would be the GAO head that picks, or someone else that chooses who runs this, and like Zach identified, for a period of time. You may wish to look at whether they can receive grants that are not for a particular issue area, but as another way of getting funding, since funding is a big issue. And you're going to want to look at the funding model for it overall, and figure out whether there's ways to insulate it from the political cycle, because of course, when you're a truth teller, sometimes telling the truth gets you punished. So you need to figure out how do you insulate them a bit from sort of the vagaries of politics. I would also look at staff, questions around staff. You want to have staff that are better paid. These are a lot of folks with like advanced degrees and doctorates who can work elsewhere, so you need to be able to pay them above $174K a year that people inside the House can get paid. There are models to do this, both making people SES equivalents and other ways to get there, but you need to think about how you can pay people well enough. There's also the fellows model that's used over at 18F, for example, where someone comes and does a 2-year or 4-year tour, sort of tour of service as sort of public interest aspect of the work that they're doing. 3 other quick things. You need to build a feedback mechanism. Are these reports actually being used? So in the UK, what they do is they actually check to see whether their equivalent of the OTA, which is called POST, whether they're being cited in committee reports, whether they're being cited in hearings. If it's not being cited and not being used, then it may not be that useful. So you can have a feedback mechanism to look at the utility. As Zach alluded to, make sure you put out information in a modern way. Like we've been talking about putting it on Wikipedia, because a lot of staff, that's the first place that they start when they do research. But just think about, generally speaking, you want these people out there interacting with the world, because a lot of the way they suck in information is not by going on ota.congress.gov, but by going and Googling it. And you want people to be able to find this stuff. So it's podcasts and videos and panel discussions and like other ways of sort of socializing the information. The new OTA would probably need to have a narrower focus because of the existence of the STAA. It needs to be able to evolve. But the big questions are going to have to do with money and pay in the funding model, because that's going to have a lot to do with how independent it is and how willing and able they are to take risks and change so they continue to meet the needs of the Congress that they're able to identify. So I know that was a lot, but there's a lot to be done differently regarding the structure for what a 2020 version of an OTA would look like.
So,
and let me just, can I just add one thought on that?
Go ahead, Zach.
So as we mentioned, there's these sort of like 2 potential vehicles for creating, this sort of TA function again. GAO is sort of like beginning to sort of strengthen their capacity. It's not anywhere near where the original OTA was in terms of the ability to sort of like churn out content that's useful on a number of these areas, building expert networks outside of the institution, the hiring authorities. It's still very early in its development. It remains to be seen kind of where it is. The other model is kind of using the OTA statute or creating a new authorizing statute that's a modernized version of OTA. Senator Tillis and Hirono, working with Mark Takano in the House, have a proposal to do this. I think it's called the Congressional Office of Technology, which is very similar to the original OTA model that addresses some of these challenges that we mentioned. And then Daniel and I proposed a model for having these 2 things coexist and specializing in different areas. Where we think GAO is really good at the sort of bean counting audit kind of work, and S&T, reviewing federal R&D investments, programs, building new military projects, things like that, right? Whereas you need a little bit of a different kind of culture to do this sort of real emerging technologies foresight work that OTA was also good at. Now, if you do GAO as a sort of primary vehicle, which is probably the most easy, pragmatic option that I think a lot of people are leaning towards, at least given the current congressional climate, we think there's a number of sort of important changes that need to happen there for it really to be successful. And Daniel and I have been working on this, which is namely that we think it needs more independence to break away from these sort of overhanging bureaucracy and culture, and achieve a relationship more like CRS has to the Library of Congress. It's under the Library of Congress, but it has statutory independence that gives it a lot of ability to sort of do its own research, make its own decisions, circumvent some of that other bureaucracy. And so in this case, we think GAO's SCAA would probably need its own appropriation line item. We think it would probably need the ability to sort of short circuit some of that bureaucracy unilaterally, with the Controller General approve more of its reports, and it needs to really start exploring using other hiring authorities like IPA, looking at rotators like DARPA and SF use, and really kind of, if it's going to ramp up, it also needs a lot of resources, which is more than what it currently has. So
great. So
I want to keep in mind.
Thanks, Zach. So on the appropriations point, that's perfect because we are at the end of our time. But before we go, I do want to turn to Franz, the appropriations expert. He taught me everything I know about appropriations when I was working on the Hill. So Franz, why don't you tell us what the appropriations process looks like and how does some of what we've been talking about fit into that? You're on mute, Franz.
Sorry, Daniel and Zach mentioned some really good ideas about ways that we can increase that science and technology capacity through the STAA at GAO, through other potential modernization models. I guess for the folks who are on the line is, we are currently in the fiscal year 21 appropriations process. Members' offices can make contributions to the appropriations committees, especially the Ledge Branch Subcommittee. I believe that the House deadline may have just passed or maybe very close, but the Senate deadline is later on in April. And it would be worth taking a look at the request from the GAO and the CRS and other things. Certainly, I think the point here is that we want to help serve as resources to you as you're looking at that and continuing conversations and providing further feedback for this year and also into future years as they continue to try to increase some of those resources of capacity to make it more available to address some of these critical national questions.
Great. Thank you, Franz. So I don't have any more questions. I think we are on the hour. Unless anyone has anything to add, I'm going to ask Michelle to help us wrap it up.
Hold on, just unmuting. Yeah, no, thank you all. This was really great, and I think everyone's available for any staff who have questions and follow up. You can reach out to any one of our speakers. We'd love to be able to provide some more information as you kind of explore these issues and how best to help Congress with its technology and science learning. So thank you all for participating. And again, just feel free to reach out to any one of us if you've got some follow-up questions.
Thank you.